The cost of a mistake in my husband's world was never paid in dollars and cents. It was paid in pieces of your soul, meticulously recorded in black ink on a crisp white page. Every error had a price, and every price was a debt of flesh and spirit. Hello, everyone. My name is Donna, and I am 84 years old now, speaking to you from a quiet little house in a town you've likely never heard of. It has taken me the better part of a century to understand that the value of a human being can't be measured by their faults, nor can their spirit be held in permanent debt. But for a long, long time, my life was governed by a different kind of accounting. Please subscribe to this channel, hit the notification bell, and leave a like on this video. And tell me in the comments, where are you listening from today? My story begins in a time that feels like another world altogether, back in the late 50s. I was a young woman then, barely 18, filled with the simple, hopeful dreams that girls in my part of the country were raised on. I pictured a small house with a porch swing, the sound of happy children playing in the yard, and a husband who, at the end of a long day, would look at me with tenderness in his eyes. Life, I thought, was a straightforward path paved with good intentions and hard work. I met Charles at a church social one warm summer evening. In a room full of boisterous young men just back from service or eager to make their mark on the world, he was an island of stillness. He wasn't the most talkative man there, nor the most handsome, but he possessed an unnerving self-assurance that both intimidated and fascinated me. When the other boys were laughing loudly or jostling one another, Charles would simply watch, his expression unreadable. He had a way of observing the world as if it were a complex machine that only he understood. His hands, I remember, were strong and capable from a life of farm work, and his gaze was dark and steady. When he finally approached me and asked for a dance, his voice was low and even, without the nervous tremor I was used to from other boys my age. As he led me onto the makeshift dance floor in the church hall, he held me with a firmness that felt, at the time, like protection. For the first time, I felt truly seen, not as a giggling girl, but as a woman. He didn't fill the silence with idle chatter. He simply danced, his focus entirely on me, making me feel as though I were the only person in the room. Looking back, I can see that what I mistook for strength was rigidity, and what I saw as assurance was an unbending need for control. But at 18, I saw a man who knew his place in the world, who seemed to offer a life of certainty and order. In a world that still felt unsteady from the echoes of war, that promise of order was a powerful lure. My father had been a kind but directionless man, and our home life was always a bit chaotic, filled with love but lacking structure. Charles was the very opposite of that. He spoke of principles, of discipline, of the land as a legacy. He made life sound like a solvable equation. We courted for a few months, a period marked by polite conversations on my family's porch and quiet drives in his sturdy pickup truck. He never spoke of frivolous things. He spoke of crop rotation, of market prices, of the importance of keeping a clean and efficient home. He wasn't romantic in the traditional sense, but he was attentive. He would notice if a button on my blouse was loose, or if my father's fence needed mending, and he would quietly fix it. I interpreted these acts as a deep and practical form of caring. I was a romantic, and I painted his quiet nature with the colors of my own longing. I told myself his silence was depth. When he asked me to marry him, it felt like the natural, logical next step. My parents were pleased. He was a landowner, a responsible man from a family with deep roots in the county. It was a good match. I was barely 19 when we stood before the preacher, and in the space of a single afternoon, my life was uprooted and transplanted to his isolated farm. It wasn't just in a rural area, it was a world unto itself, miles down a gravel road that was often impassable in the winter. The nearest neighbor was a distant speck on the horizon, and the nearest town was a 30-minute drive away. The farm was vast, a sea of corn and soy that stretched to the edge of the sky, surrounded by endless fields where a person could feel profoundly alone. And the most important word in that sentence is alone. Alone, away from neighbors, away from town, away from prying eyes. There, in the sturdy old farmhouse, lived his mother, Patricia. She was a woman who seemed to have been carved from the same hard earth as the farm itself. Her face was a mask of stern neutrality, and she spoke only when absolutely necessary, often in short, clipped pronouncements that sounded like judgments. Waste not, want not. Idle hands are the devil's workshop. She was the silent, watchful shadow of the house, a perfect complement to Charles's quiet authority. Her presence was constant, a low hum of disapproval that kept me perpetually on edge. She never raised her voice, never argued. She didn't need to. Her silence was a weapon, and she wielded it with surgical precision. She was the witness, the judge, and the jury in a court where I was always on trial. In the beginning, married life was calm. It was a demanding routine of chores that started before sunrise and ended long after sunset, but I was young and strong, and I accepted it as my role. I was a farm wife now. I cooked, I cleaned, I mended, I helped with the canning and preserving. I did everything I was supposed to do, eager to prove myself a capable partner. Charles managed everything else, the finances, the harvests, the running of the farm. And, as it soon became terrifyingly clear, he also managed my every move. The rules of the house were unspoken, but they were as solid as the stone foundation. Meals were to be on the table at precisely 6 in the morning, noon, and 6 in the evening. The house was to be kept spotless. No expenditure, no matter how small, was to be made without his explicit approval. My opinions on matters of the farm were never sought, and if I offered one, it was met with a silence that made it clear I had overstepped. I was lonely, but I told myself this was the adjustment period. I missed the easy chatter of my own family, the laughter of my sisters. Here, the only sounds were the wind whistling through the eaves, the ticking of the grandfather clock in the hall, and Patricia's occasional, sharp sigh. The calm, however, was merely the placid surface of a dark and deep lake. The true nature of my marriage, the reality of the prison I had walked into, was revealed with the appearance of the object that would come to define my existence, the ledger. It wasn't an ordinary farm account book. It was a large, handsome volume, bound in thick black leather, the kind a banker or a lawyer might use. Charles kept it on the highest shelf of the heavy oak hutch in the kitchen, right next to the clock, a place of honor. He never took it down without purpose, and whenever he did, the very atmosphere in the room would shift, growing heavy and cold as soon as its dark spine was visible in his hands. The first time he used it for me was a few months after our wedding, on a crisp autumn afternoon. I had been distracted by a bird outside the window while cooking, and I let the stew scorch, blackening the bottom of the heavy pot. It was a simple, careless mistake, the kind any young wife might make. I was mortified and apologetic, expecting a sharp word or a sigh of frustration. I got neither. Charles didn't raise his voice. He didn't even frown. He simply looked at the ruined pot, then at me, and then he walked to the hutch. My heart began to pound a slow, heavy rhythm against my ribs as he reached up and took down the black ledger. He placed it on the kitchen table with a soft thud, the sound echoing in the unnerving silence. He pulled out the chair, sat down, and opened the book to a fresh page, his movements slow, deliberate, and utterly chilling. Patricia, who was darning socks by the hearth, looked up, her needles stopping their rhythmic click. She watched, her face betraying nothing, but her attention was absolute. "Donna," Charles said, his voice a terrifyingly calm monotone. He didn't look at me. He was staring at the blank page before him. A failure in household duty is a failure of order. Order is what separates prosperity from ruin. Disorder, he paused, dipping a fine-nibbed fountain pen into a pot of ink, is a debt. I stood there, frozen, my hands smelling of burnt stew, feeling as though I had been summoned before a tribunal. He began to write, his pen scratching against the paper with a crisp, implacable sound. His penmanship was perfect, an elegant, controlled script that was as cold and precise as his voice. I will never forget what he wrote. I can still see the words forming on the page in my mind's eye, the ink a stark, damning black against the clean white. October 12th. Stew burned due to inattention, waste of provisions, breach of household discipline, debit, 1 day of silence and fasting. I felt the blood drain from my face, my breath caught in my throat. An entire day without speaking, without eating? It wasn't the hunger that frightened me most, though the thought of it was daunting. It was the humiliation. It was the cold, transactional nature of the punishment, my simple mistake transformed into a formal entry in a book of transgressions. It was an act of profound depersonalization. I was no longer his wife who had made a mistake. I was a debtor, and a penalty had been levied. He blotted the ink carefully, closed the ledger, and placed it back on its high shelf. He then turned to me, his expression unchanged. "The payment will be observed starting now," he said, and then he walked out of the kitchen as if nothing had happened. The punishment was carried out to the letter. For the next 24 hours, a complete and total silence was imposed upon me. I tried to speak once, to ask Patricia where the lye soap was, and she simply looked through me, her expression a wall of stone, and turned away. It was as if I had ceased to exist. When dinner time came, Charles and his mother ate their meal while I sat at the table with an empty plate before me, the gnawing in my stomach a dull ache compared to the sharp sting of shame. Charles didn't gloat. He didn't even seem to notice. He ate his meal, discussed the weather with Patricia, and ignored me completely. His cruelty wasn't passionate or angry. It was something far more terrifying. It was detached, methodical, and rooted in a righteousness that I couldn't begin to comprehend. That was the beginning. The Black Ledger was not a tool, it was a god. It was his system, the charter of his tyranny, the physical manifestation of his soul. And in the crushing silence of that first punishment, I understood that I hadn't just married a man. I had become an entry in his ledger, a name on a long list of debts waiting to be paid. My life, from that moment on, would be a relentless, terrifying exercise in balancing the books. That first entry in the Black Ledger was not an isolated event. It was the laying of a cornerstone for the prison that would become my life. The system of accounting, as Charles called it, was not static. It was designed to grow, to evolve, to wrap its tendrils around every aspect of my existence until I could no longer remember what it felt like to breathe freely. In the months that followed, the debts accumulated more quickly than I could ever hope to pay them. Charles maintained his register with a meticulousness that was almost religious. The book was not a weapon he wielded in anger. It was a sacred text, the foundation of the order he worshipped. The infractions were no longer confined to simple household mistakes. My very being, it seemed, was a source of endless disorder. If I sighed too loudly while mending his clothes, it was interpreted as a lack of enthusiasm for domestic duty. If he asked my opinion on something, a rare and terrifying occurrence, and I hesitated for a moment too long, he would note a failure of spousal support and clarity of mind. Every emotion I displayed that was not one of cheerful, silent submission was a potential crime against the household. The ledger had become a distorted mirror, reflecting back at me a version of myself that was composed entirely of flaws, inadequacies, and failures, all seen through the cold lens of my husband's judgment. I remember one winter, the snow piling up in great drifts that cut us off from the rest of the world for weeks. I came down with a terrible flu that left me bedridden, shivering with fever. I was weak, aching, and barely able to stand. For 2 weeks, I was useless. Patricia took over my chores with a quiet, martyred air that was its own form of punishment. Charles waited until I was back on my feet, though still pale and fragile, to conduct his accounting. He sat me down at the kitchen table one evening, the oil lamp casting long, dancing shadows on the wall. He didn't speak of my health or ask if I was feeling stronger. He simply took down the black ledger. He opened it and wrote, his voice following the scratch of the pen. January 3rd through 17th, prolonged incapacitation, failure to provide for the needs of the household, a debt against the family's order, debit, 15 days of reduced rations, to commence immediately for the restoration of discipline and gratitude. On that day, the injustice of it struck me with a violence that even his previous punishments had not. I had been sick. It was not a moral failing. It was a simple human frailty. But in Charles's system, weakness was the ultimate sin. Sickness was not a condition to be healed, but a form of disorder to be corrected. His judgment was absolute and without appeal. It was then that I truly understood he did not see me as his wife, as a partner, as a person. He saw me as a tool, an asset whose performance was expected to be constant and flawless. He would not tolerate the messiness of humanity in me. Patricia, sitting in her usual chair by the fire, watched this spectacle with a chilling calm. She showed no surprise, no pity. If anything, there was a quiet look of satisfaction in her eyes, as if his pronouncement had simply confirmed a truth she had always known. It was she who, over the next 15 days, measured my portions of bread and soup, her hand steady, her expression unreadable, ensuring the discipline was properly administered. Her role in this tyranny was subtle, but essential. She never gave the orders, but she was the loyal and unwavering enforcer of the system. In doing so, she communicated a silent, damning message. This is the law of this house. I have always abided by it. You will do the same. She was the moral guardian of his cruelty, the living proof that Charles was not alone in his madness. Their unity was a fortress, and I was the solitary prisoner within its walls. Over time, I developed a strategy for survival. It was a strategy of erasure. I began to move through the house like a ghost, to exist in the shadows. I spoke less, I smiled less. I effaced myself, striving to become the perfect, silent, task-oriented machine they seemed to desire. I monitored my own footsteps, my gestures, the expression on my face. I learned to control the involuntary sigh of exhaustion, to mask the flicker of sadness in my eyes. My entire existence became a singular, all-consuming mission. Do not feed the ledger. Leave its pages blank. For a few weeks at a time, it would work. There would be long, empty, silent days where the black ledger remained on its shelf, untouched. Those days were my fragile victories, my brief moments of respite from the constant threat of judgment. I would feel a sliver of peace, a dangerous glimmer of hope that maybe, if I was good enough, if I was perfect enough, the accounting would cease. Then, I became pregnant with our first child, Linda. A pregnancy should have been a time of grace, a period of joy and anticipation. For me, it was a season of heightened terror. My body was no longer entirely my own, its needs and changes outside of my control. The relentless fatigue of the first trimester, the bouts of morning sickness that would come without warning, the simple, desperate need for rest, these were not miracles of life in Charles's eyes. They were new and profound opportunities for failure. And he did not hesitate to document them. August 20th, he wrote one afternoon, after I'd had to sit down while weeding the garden, overcome with dizziness. Excessive fatigue during afternoon chores. The needs of the household supersede personal weakness. Debit, corrective reading. Corrective reading was a new and particularly insidious chapter in his Manual of Psychological Torture. He had a collection of old, severe books, treatises on husbandry and household management from a century before. That evening, He forced me to sit on a hard-backed chair while he read aloud passages about the duties of a farm wife, about her uncomplaining fortitude, her tireless service to her husband and land. He read in a flat, dispassionate monotone, stripping the words of any humanity, turning them into a droning sermon of my own inadequacy. All the while, he would occasionally glance at my growing belly, as if my pregnancy were a betrayal, a selfish indulgence that was already an affront to the property he owned. I remember approaching Patricia once, and only once, about these sessions. It was a moment of sheer desperation. Charles was out in the fields, and I found her shelling peas on the back porch. I spoke in a whisper, my voice trembling. "Couldn't you ask him to stop? Don't you see how tired I am?" She paused her work, her thumb pressing a pea from its pod with a soft pop. She raised her cool gray eyes to mine, and the judgment in them was as clear and hard as glass. "Exhaustion is a distraction, Donna," she said, her voice devoid of any warmth. "It is a sign that your mind is not focused on your purpose. A strong woman bears the burdens of her life without complaint. Charles is teaching you your duty. You should be grateful." That single response shattered the last of my hope. It sealed my solitude. The mother and her son were one, bound by the same ironclad ideology of control and discipline. I was not just their prisoner, I was a delinquent in need of re-education. There was no ally to be found, no court of appeal, no advocate for the defense. I was utterly and completely alone, my body's natural processes being recorded as sins in the ever-watchful ledger. The pregnancy progressed in this state of constant, low-grade anxiety. Every movement, every moment of rest, every wave of nausea was a potential fault to be recorded in the black ledger, its weight becoming an invisible but palpable burden on my shoulders. When my daughter Linda was finally born, I held her in my arms and wept with a relief so profound it felt like pain. For a brief, naive moment, I believed her arrival would bring a truce, an unexpected softness into the hard corners of our home. The fierce, all-consuming love I felt for my child was the only lifeline I had. I clung to her tiny, warm body as if she were proof that life could still hold goodness, that my own heart had not yet turned to stone. She was my secret joy, a tiny sunbeam in a house of shadows. But the birth of my daughter did not change the system. It only expanded it. It did not take long for Charles to extend the jurisdiction of the Black Ledger to my performance as a mother. A new chapter of accounting had begun. "May 4th, he wrote, when Linda was just a few weeks old and had been crying inconsolably with colic. Infant cries without immediate reason. The wife has failed to impose calm. Debit. Isolated reflection." Isolated reflection meant I was locked in the pantry for 2 hours. I could hear my baby's wails through the thick wooden door, and my heart felt like it was being torn from my chest. Every instinct screamed for me to go to her, to comfort her, but I was powerless. Patricia would be tending to her, I knew, but in her cold, efficient way, without the love and comfort only a mother can provide. And that, I realized with a fresh wave of horror, was precisely what Charles intended. He was using my deepest, most primal feelings against me. The more I loved my child, the more vulnerable I was to his control. The payment of my debts no longer affected just me. It poisoned the very air my daughter breathed. The ledger was no longer just the record of my life. It was the constitution of our home. And its first and only amendment was the utter absence of mercy. A few years after Linda, our son Robert was born. If Linda was my secret light, my reason to hope, Robert was my reason to endure. His arrival cemented my resolve to shield them both. I had to continue moving forward, even on the days when the weight of the Black Ledger felt like a physical stone, bending my spine. I became a buffer, an emotional rampart, determined to absorb all the shockwaves of Charles's tyranny so that their childhoods could remain untouched by the terror that defined my own existence. But protecting 2 children was a terrifyingly complex mission. Before, I had only to monitor myself. Now, every loud laugh from Linda, every tumble Robert took in the yard, every innocent mess they made, became a risk of an inscription in the Great Register. Charles had made it clear that any failure in the children's education or behavior was, in fact, my failure. I was responsible for the total order of the domain, and that now extended to the discipline of my own children, all under the ever-watchful eye of Patricia. Patricia had a particular way of exercising her surveillance. She never shouted, never complained to me directly. Instead, she would make dry, cutting observations to Charles, usually in my presence, acting as the incorruptible rapporteur of my every failing. "Charles," she would say at the dinner table, her voice flat, "I saw Donna let Robert play with his food this afternoon. A child's discipline begins at the table. It is a sign of laxity." Or, "Charles, Linda was singing in the house today. A house of work is not a place for idle noise. It disturbs the focus." These remarks, delivered with the dispassionate air of a weather report, were direct incitements to sanction. They were undeniable proof that she did not see my children as her grandchildren, as sources of joy and life, but as additional elements to be controlled, new variables in Charles's equation of order. And every time Charles reached for the black ledger after one of Patricia's observations, the last vestiges of any possible bond between me and my mother-in-law crumbled into dust. I saw her with perfect clarity. She didn't seek their well-being. She sought their subjugation, and through them, my own. I lived in a state of permanent, heightened stress. My body had learned to exist in a constant state of tension. I remember nights spent with every muscle clenched, and mornings when I would wake with a splitting headache, the result of a vigilance that never ceased, even in sleep. The sound of a heavy footstep in the hall, the quiet snick of the drawer where Charles kept his pen, even the rhythmic ticking of the clock. Any unexpected sound was enough to make my heart leap into my throat. The black ledger itself had become a malevolent entity. I dared not look at it, but I could feel its presence, enthroned on the hutch, a dark monument to injustice. Its presence alone was enough to remind me that I was nothing more than a collection of debts to be paid. Sometimes, late at night, I would stare at its silhouette in the dark, trying to comprehend the evil it contained. How could a simple object of paper and leather possess such destructive power? It was the materialization of arbitrary rule, the proof that logic and love had no place in this home. The most insidious part of his system was the way Charles learned to manipulate me with the threat of future punishment. He didn't always levy a sentence immediately. Sometimes he would leave me in suspense. He would record an offense, close the book, and say, with a calm, deliberate tone, "For now, this is a debit held in suspense, Donna, a debt awaiting settlement. We will let it accrue interest." A debt in suspense was 1,000 times worse than the punishment itself. It forced me to live with a guillotine hanging over my head, making me even more submissive, more conciliatory, more desperate to please in the days that followed, all to avoid the impending settlement. I became a slave not only to my past actions, but to my future fears. It was a twisted, brilliant, psychological tactic designed to break any internal resistance. He didn't just want fear, he wanted my voluntary servitude. I did not know it then, standing in that cold kitchen, watching my life being transcribed into a catalogue of failures. But the ink in that book, the very tool of my oppression, would one day be used to write the name of my own daughter. It was a thought so terrifying that my mind, for the time being, refused to even form it. But the seed had been planted. The system was not just for me, it was for the house. And my children lived in that house. The years that followed were etched into a rhythm of quiet dread. Life on the farm settled into a grim and predictable pattern, governed by the silent, ever-present authority of the Black Ledger. I became an expert in self-effacement, a master of anticipating Charles's moods and Patricia's silent criticisms. My world shrank to the dimensions of that house and the rules, both spoken and unspoken, that governed it. My own personality, the dreams and laughter of the young woman I had once been, were packed away like old clothes, stored in a dusty attic of my mind that I rarely dared to visit. My children, Linda and Robert, grew up in this atmosphere of oppressive silence. They learned before they could properly speak that our home was not a place for loud noises, for spontaneous joy, or for the messy, beautiful chaos of a normal childhood. They learned to play quietly, to put their toys away with meticulous care, to walk instead of run. They learned that their father was a figure to be respected from a distance, a man who required order above all else. They learned that their grandmother's sharp, silent gaze missed nothing. They did not know the reason for the tension that hung in the air like a permanent, low-lying fog, but they breathed it in with every breath. It shaped them. I did everything in my power to create a small, secret world of warmth for them. In the quiet of their bedroom, when I tucked them in at night, I would whisper stories and sing soft lullabies, my voice barely audible. These were stolen moments of tenderness, fleeting and precious. This was the only place I could be a mother in the way my heart longed to be, away from the accounting of the ledger. But I was always listening for the sound of footsteps in the hall, always ready to fall silent at a moment's notice. My greatest mission was to keep their names from ever appearing on those crisp, white pages. I was a vigilant guardian, hovering over them, correcting their small mistakes before they could be noticed, absorbing the blame for any minor infraction. If a glass of milk was spilled, I would clean it up with frantic speed, claiming it was my fault. If a toy was left out, I would hide it away, my heart pounding. I was living a life of constant, nerve-shredding vigilance, not for my own sake anymore, but for theirs. I was their shield, and I was growing weary, the weight of it pressing down on me, year after year. Linda, my daughter, was 6 years old when the world tilted on its axis. She was a bright, curious child, with a mind that was always asking questions. It was her greatest quality, and in our house, it was her greatest danger. She had a way of observing the world with a stark, innocent logic that could cut through layers of pretense and silence. She had seen her father take down the big, black book. She had seen the look on my face when he did. She did not understand it, but she had catalogued it, filed it away in her observant little mind. One evening at the dinner table, the three of us, Charles, Patricia, and I, were eating in our usual strained silence. The children had eaten earlier and were playing quietly in the living room. Charles was in a reflective mood, which was often more dangerous than his anger. He began speaking about the history of the farm, about his grandfather who had built the house with his own 2 hands, about the principles of hard work and discipline that had been passed down through the generations. "This land doesn't reward weakness," he said, looking out the window at the darkening fields. "It demands order. It demands a clear accounting of every seed planted, every dollar spent, every hour of work. Disorder is a weed. You let it grow, even a little, and it will choke out everything." He was not speaking to me, or even to Patricia. He was speaking to the universe, articulating his grim philosophy. And it was into this cold pronouncement that Linda's clear, piping voice floated in from the other room. She had been standing in the doorway, listening. "Is that why you have the big black book, Daddy?" she asked. The silence that followed her question was not like the other silences in our house. This was a different entity altogether. It was absolute, heavy, and immediate. The air thickened, became hard to breathe. I saw Patricia's hand, which had been lifting a fork to her mouth, freeze in mid-air. Charles stopped breathing. He slowly turned his head, his entire body rigid, and looked at his daughter. It was the first time a child had ever named the object of his tyranny. She had spoken the unspeakable. Linda, of course, had no concept of the magnitude of her words. She was simply connecting the dots, making sense of her world. "Mama gets very quiet when you write in it," she added, her voice full of innocent curiosity. "Does the book have a list of all the weeds?" My blood ran cold. I wanted to scream, to snatch the words out of the air, to undo the last 30 seconds. I could feel a cold sweat break out on my neck. I looked at Charles, and his face was a blank canvas. No anger, no shock, just a chilling, profound stillness. He didn't answer her. He simply turned back to his plate and continued to eat his meal as if she hadn't spoken. But the silence that filled the rest of that dinner was the loudest sound I had ever heard. It was the sound of a line being crossed. It was the sound of a sentence being prepared. Later that evening, as I was putting the children to bed, my hands were trembling so badly I could barely fasten the buttons on Robert's pajamas. I kissed them both, my heart aching with a terrible, formless fear. I lingered in their room, listening to the sound of their soft breathing, trying to draw strength from their innocence. Then I heard it, the familiar, dreadful sound from the kitchen below, the scrape of a chair on the wooden floor, the soft, heavy thud of the black ledger being placed on the table. I knew. With a certainty that was as cold and sharp as a shard of ice in my gut, I knew that the moment I had dreaded for 6 long years had finally arrived. The terror I had lived with for so long was no longer a vague threat. It had a name, and its name was Linda. At that instant, something inside me shifted. The years of fear, of submission, of self-erasure began to burn away, replaced by a feeling so fierce and primal, it left no room for anything else. The instinct of a mother to protect her child is not a rational thing. It is a force of nature. And it had finally, terrifyingly, been awakened. My legs moved on their own, carrying me down the stairs and into the kitchen. The scene was just as I had pictured it, a tableau of quiet horror illuminated by the warm glow of the oil lamp. Charles was seated at the table, his broad back to me. The black ledger was open before him. The pen was in his hand, its nib glistening with fresh ink. He wasn't writing about me. He was preparing the future. I crept closer, my stockinged feet making no sound on the floorboards. My senses were on high alert, every detail magnified. I saw the page. It was a fresh, clean sheet, and at the top, in my husband's elegant, merciless script, were 2 words. It was not my name. It read, Linda, family name. It was the single most monstrous thing I had ever seen. He was not punishing her for a specific act. He was inducting her. He was institutionalizing the terror for my daughter, opening her account in his bank of cruelty before she had even committed a single, real infraction. He was creating a vessel for her future mistakes, a repository for her future humiliation. He was ensuring the legacy of his tyranny would be passed down to the next generation. He must have sensed my presence, because he slowly lifted his head and turned to meet my gaze. His eyes were devoid of all emotion, showing only a rigid, unbending resolve. "She asked questions," he said, his voice low and even. "She has shown an unhealthy curiosity about the affairs of adults, Donna. A child in this house must learn that silence is the first virtue. Order must be established early." He looked back at the page, a hint of something that might have been pride in his voice. "She has inherited the disorder you brought into this family. Your softness. I am giving her a fresh page so she can begin to pay for her own faults of character." In that moment, something inside me broke. It wasn't my body, which was already marked by years of his corrections. It was the last, frayed thread of the submissive wife that still remained. I was no longer Donna, the debtor. I was Linda's mother. A wave of ice-cold clarity, a strength I never knew I possessed, washed over me, drowning the fear. This was no longer about surviving. It was about saving. I managed to keep my voice from shaking. I tried to bargain, a last, desperate plea. "Charles, please, she's just a child. Let me teach her. Give me time. I'll make sure she understands." He gave a soft, joyless laugh. "The ledger does not wait for promises, Donna. It records realities. But you are her mother. If she fails, you will pay her debt. The penalty will be double, but the child's account must be established. It is the law of this family." He dipped his pen in the inkwell one last time and began to write the first entry under Linda's name. October 27th. Breach of household discipline in speech. First entry. Debit. He hadn't yet finished writing the punishment, but I didn't need to see it. My gaze was fixed on the black ledger itself, this physical proof of his madness. I knew, with a sudden, absolute conviction, that if I left this house, I could not leave without it. Without it, no one would ever believe me. It wasn't just the record of my suffering. It was his weapon, his soul, the very source of his power, and I had to take it from him. As if on cue, the universe gave me my chance. The weather, which had been heavy and oppressive all day, finally broke. A low rumble of thunder echoed in the distance. A summer storm, sudden and violent, was rolling in across the plains. The first heavy drops of rain, as big as coins, began to spatter against the window pane. The thunder was my opportunity. The noise would cover my movements. Charles, ever the protector of his property, stood up, his attention immediately shifting to the possibility of a leak in the barn roof. "I need to check the hayloft," he said, his voice tight with annoyance at the storm's inconvenient timing. He strode out of the house, pulling on his boots, leaving the ledger open on the table. Patricia, who was hard of hearing, had already retired to her room for the night. I had a window of time. A few precious, terrifying minutes. It was a single, desperate chance. I moved toward the table. The black ledger lay there, a dark stain in the warm lamplight. I reached for it, my heart hammering against my ribs so hard I thought it would break through. For a second, the old fear paralyzed me. What if he came back? What if he caught me? The punishment for this, stealing his sacred book, would be unimaginable. But then I looked at the page again, at my daughter's name. And the hesitation vanished, burned away by a mother's rage. I snatched the book. It felt heavy in my hands, thick with the weight of years of suffering. I clutched it to my chest like a shield and ran upstairs to the children's room. I pulled Linda from her bed first. She woke with a start, frightened by the rising storm, but she saw the look in my eyes and fell silent. "Shh, my love," I whispered, my voice urgent. "Mama has to go on a trip. We have to play a very important quiet game. Do you understand? The child's instinct for danger is a powerful thing." She didn't cry. She simply nodded, her small arms wrapping tightly around my neck. I then scooped up Robert, who was only 3, wrapping him in his blanket. The rain was lashing against the house now, and the wind howled down the chimney, a wild symphony that covered the sound of the back door creaking open. I tucked the black ledger under my thin shawl, its cold leather pressing against my skin, a shameful but necessary burden. I ran, out into the cold, driving rain, across the muddy yard. Each flash of lightning lit up the farm, and with each flash, I expected to see the back door open, to see Charles's silhouette framed in the doorway. The adrenaline was a fire in my veins, erasing all thought of exhaustion or pain. I just needed to move. We reached the dark shape of the barn, then the path that led out to the rear fields. The rain was a blessing, washing away our tracks, a curtain of sound and water to hide us. I ran toward the only possible escape route, the old logging trail that cut through the woods at the far edge of the property. As I ran, the corner of the black ledger dug into my ribs with every step, a constant, painful reminder of what I was carrying. It was my burden and my indictment, but it was also, paradoxically, the key to my freedom. I could not leave it behind. It was not just a book, it was the very essence of the man I was fleeing, the tangible proof of the sickness he had tried to pass on to my daughter. Each flash of lightning showed me the path forward, but with every clap of thunder that shook the ground, I expected to hear his voice behind us, calling in a debt I could never, ever hope to pay. Flight is a desperate, frantic sprint, but survival is a long, grueling marathon. Once the fire of adrenaline from that stormy night had burned itself out, an abyssal exhaustion washed over me, threatening to pull me under. I was crushed by the weight of my 2 sleeping children and the cold, hard reality of the black ledger tucked beneath my arm. Huddled together under the meager shelter of a thick pine grove as the storm subsided, I looked at the pale, uncertain light of dawn and understood the true extent of my recklessness. I had nothing. No food, no money to speak of, just a few dollars I'd managed to hide away in a small coin purse over the years. My shoes were thin and already soaked through, and the shawl I had grabbed was poor protection against the lingering chill. But I had my children, and I had the proof. As the sun rose, casting a watery gray light over the drenched landscape, the first thing I did was find a hiding place for the ledger. I couldn't carry it with me. It was too conspicuous, too dangerous. But I couldn't destroy it or leave it behind either. It was the anchor of my pain and the only key to my truth. It was the one thing that gave me the courage to face the unknown, for it represented the power, the very soul I had wrested from Charles. I found a spot far from the main road, a place I knew I would never forget, a magnificent, ancient oak tree that stood alone in a small clearing, its branches twisted and gnarled like an old man's hands. At its base, among the thick roots, I dug a hole with my bare hands until my fingers were raw and bleeding. I found a piece of discarded oilcloth near a collapsed fence line, wrapped the book tightly, and laid it in the shallow grave. Before I covered it, I opened it one last time to the page with Linda's name. The entry for her debt was still unfinished. I found a small piece of charcoal from a long-dead fire nearby, and with a trembling hand, I wrote underneath his script. It was a childish, symbolic act, but it was for me. I wrote, "Credit, freedom, payment rendered in full." Then I buried it. As I patted the damp earth back into place, I felt as if I were burying my old life, my old self. Donna, the debtor, was now hidden beneath the roots of that old oak tree. A new woman had to be born, a woman capable of surviving this. Our wandering began. We walked south, always south, keeping to the small dirt roads and forgotten farm tracks. I avoided towns during the day and taught the children to be quiet and watchful. Linda, despite being only 6, showed a resilience that humbled me. She understood, through the tense set of my shoulders and my constant hushed warnings, that our very important quiet game was a matter of life and death. She didn't complain about the walking or the hunger. She held her little brother's hand, her face serious and solemn, carrying the invisible burden of a stolen childhood. It was the sight of my children's shattered innocence that forged an iron strength in me. I found work where I could, small pockets of mercy in a harsh world. I picked fruit for a few dollars a day in sprawling orchards, my back screaming in protest. I washed mountains of dishes in the steamy kitchens of roadside diners in exchange for a hot meal for the children and a few leftovers I could wrap in a napkin for later. I presented myself as a widow. My name was Donna, I would say, and my husband had passed away in a sudden accident on our farm, which we had lost to the bank. It was a simple, tragic lie, but it was effective. It elicited pity, not suspicion, and it steered questions away from the life I had fled. I knew Charles would be looking for a fugitive, a disobedient wife. He would never be looking for a grieving widow. The hardest part was not the physical exhaustion or the constant gnawing hunger. It was the secret I carried. It was the silence. I couldn't tell my children the truth about the Black Ledger, about the system of debts, about the years of fear that had hollowed me out. I had to raise them in a world where love was given freely, where mistakes were met with forgiveness, not penance. I had to erase the shadow of their father from their minds, and to do that, I had to act like a normal, loving, fearless mother. It was a form of silent psychological torture. Every time Linda would laugh with pure, uninhibited joy, a part of me would flinch, expecting an invisible hand to clamp down, a cold voice to reprimand the idle noise. Every time Robert would cry from a scraped knee or a small hunger, I had to fight the voice in my own head, Charles's voice, Patricia's voice, that told me I was being indulgent, that I was allowing disorder, that I was accumulating new debts by failing to enforce discipline. The mind is slow to leave a prison, even when the body is free. The rules of the Black Ledger were carved into the very pathways of my brain. For months, for years, I had to actively fight against that internal voice that whispered of my inadequacy, my failings, my endless unpayable debt. One evening, about a year into our journey, we were sheltering in a barn, thanks to the kindness of a farmer's wife who had given us a meal. I was half asleep in the hay when Linda began to cry out in her sleep. She wasn't whimpering from a nightmare about a monster. Her cry was filled with a specific and familiar guilt. "Mama, I spilled it," she sobbed, still trapped in her dream. "I spilled the water. Is he going to write in the book?" My heart seized in my chest. It felt as though an icy hand had squeezed it. Despite all my efforts, all our miles, the seed of his terror had been planted in her, and it was growing in the dark soil of her memory. I gathered her into my arms, rocking her gently, stroking her hair. "Shh, my sweet girl, you're safe," I whispered, my own tears hot on my cheeks. "There is no more book, Linda. There are no more debts for spilled water. We just wipe it up and it's gone. That's all. In our new life, there is no book. There is only love. Do you hear me? Only love." It was in that moment, holding my trembling daughter in the dusty darkness of a stranger's barn, that I understood the true battle ahead. It wasn't against Charles, the man of flesh and blood who was miles away. It was against the ghost of his system, against the memory of his rules that haunted my children's minds. My life's work now was to create a new grammar for their lives, a new language where value was inherent, not earned, and where forgiveness was the only currency that mattered. After nearly 3 years of wandering, of living hand to mouth, we finally made our way to a small, unremarkable factory town in a state so far from our old life that I finally felt a fragile sense of safety. The town was a place of smokestacks and modest, identical houses, a place where people were too busy with their own hard lives to ask too many questions about a quiet woman and her 2 children. I found a job at a textile mill. The work was deafeningly loud and mind-numbingly repetitive, the air thick with cotton dust. But it offered a small, steady paycheck, and more importantly, it offered a simple human dignity. My boss, a gruff but fair man named Mr. Henderson, didn't keep a ledger of my moral failings. He paid me for the work I did. At the end of a long week, he would press the wages into my hand and sometimes even offer a tired smile. It was the first time in years that I had seen a man in a position of authority exercise it with basic fairness. With my first few paychecks, I rented a tiny 2-room apartment above a bakery. The day I was given the key was one of the most significant of my life. It was a small, simple, metal key, but it represented a sovereignty I had not known since I was a girl. It was the key to my own door, a door I could lock. It turned my 2 small rooms into a fortress. The years began to pass in a blur of work and raising my children. I worked tirelessly to make sure they never missed a meal, to ensure they had books for school, to give them the education that the Black Ledger would have deemed an unnecessary expense. And slowly, miraculously, Linda and Robert began to heal. They grew into bright, happy, well-adjusted children. The farm became a distant, foggy memory for them, the strange rules of their father fading like a bad dream. They no longer spoke of it. The terror receded, becoming an old scar that had ceased to ache. But I never forgot. I couldn't. I carried the secret of the ledger inside me, and once a year, every year, I made a pilgrimage. I would request 2 days off from the mill, telling my boss it was to visit a sick relative. I would take a long, rattling bus ride that took a day and a half, back to the county I had once called home. I would walk the miles from the bus station out into the countryside, to that clearing with the ancient, solitary oak tree. There, I would dig. My hands, now calloused from the factory, were stronger than they had been. I would unearth the oilcloth-wrapped parcel. I would hold the black ledger in my hands for a few minutes, feeling the weight of my past, the coldness of the leather. I would check my defiant inscription on Linda's page. Credit. Freedom. This ritual was not an act of nostalgia. It was a reminder. It was my way of keeping the truth of my past alive, of ensuring I could never be tempted to doubt the severity of the evil I had escaped. It was a private, necessary communion with my own survival. The Black Ledger was a gruesome relic of war, but it was essential to my resilience, the ultimate proof that my new life was not a dream. It was during one of these annual pilgrimages, nearly 10 years after my escape, that I realized the ledger had one final, unexpected role to play. Justice, it turned out, had a memory as long and as permanent as the black ink on its pages. I was preparing to rebury the book, carefully wrapping it in its shroud, when I heard a sound that was not the wind or the rustle of leaves. It was the sound of footsteps, heavy, deliberate footsteps approaching the clearing. My heart leaped into my throat. The old, ancestral fear, the smell of the damp earth, the terror of being caught, it all came rushing back in a single, sickening wave. I froze, clutching the book to my chest, my body tensing for flight. A figure emerged from the trees at the edge of the clearing. It was a man. But as he drew closer, I saw he was not Charles. He was an older man, dressed in a formal suit that looked out of place in the woods. He had a tired, official air about him, and he was holding a piece of paper in his hand. He saw me, standing there with the half-buried, dirt-stained book in my arms. I knew it was too late to hide. The hunt was over, but the outcome was not what I had spent a decade fearing. The man stopped a few feet away. "Ma'am," he said, his voice polite but firm, "I believe you might be Mrs. Donna, formerly of the old farmstead." I could only nod, my throat tight with a fear I couldn't name. He glanced at the black book in my hands, a flicker of puzzlement crossing his face, then looked back down at his notes. "This is a complicated business," he said with a sigh. "My name is Mr. Johnson. I'm an attorney. I'm here regarding a matter of inheritance, the estate of your mother-in-law, Mrs. Patricia." He looked up at me, his expression softening slightly. "She's passed away." I didn't know what to feel. Relief? Sadness? Indifference? It was none of those things. It was just a strange, hollow emptiness. Then he continued, and his next words painted a picture I could never have imagined in my wildest dreams. A picture of a system that had, in my absence, finally consumed itself. "Your husband, Mr. Charles," the lawyer said, pausing to let the words sink in, "has been in the state penitentiary for the last 3 years." The lawyer's words hung in the quiet air of the clearing, seeming to warp the very fabric of reality. In the state penitentiary for the last 3 years. The man who had built his entire world on the concept of perfect, unassailable order, the man who was the ultimate judge and arbiter of a private, cruel justice, was himself a common criminal. The irony was so profound, so staggering, that I felt a dizzying sense of vertigo. I had to steady myself against the rough bark of the old oak tree. Mr. Johnson waited patiently, allowing me to gather my wits. "In prison?" I finally managed to whisper, the words feeling foreign in my mouth. For what? I imagined some terrible act of violence, a final explosive loss of the control he so cherished. The truth was both more mundane and more fitting. For matters of accounting, the lawyer said, adjusting his glasses. It was a complex scheme involving farm subsidies and fraudulent land claims. It seems your husband and his mother were using the farm as a front for years of illegal transactions. Their books didn't add up. The books. It always came back to the books. The man who had codified the moral debts of his own family had fallen because of a different kind of ledger. The black ledger had finally devoured its master. And Patricia? I asked, my voice growing stronger. She passed from a heart attack 6 weeks ago, he explained. By all accounts, she never recovered from the shame of her son's imprisonment. There was a hint of professional sympathy in his voice, but I felt nothing. Patricia, the silent accomplice, the unwavering enforcer, had paid her own final debt. But it's her will that is problematic, Mr. Johnson continued, opening a file he was carrying. And that's why I'm here. It reveals a financial arrangement dating back decades, long before your marriage. It seems the farm, this entire estate, never legally belonged to Charles. I blinked, confused. But it was his life. He managed every inch of it. He managed it, yes, the lawyer affirmed, but the property was jointly owned by his mother, Patricia, and her estranged brother, a man named Larry, an uncle you have apparently never met. The ownership was split, and in her will, Patricia left her entire share not to her son Charles, but to you and your children, Linda and Robert. I was stunned into silence. A share of the farm? A piece of the very hell I had escaped? It made no sense. Why? Why would she do that? Mr. Johnson hesitated, looking down at the document. Patricia's will is a strange thing. It's more of a final judgment than a testament. She included a short, specific clause. It states that she bequeaths her share to you and her grandchildren on one condition, that you can provide irrefutable proof that her son, Charles, was unfit to manage his inheritance with humanity and decency. And there it was, Patricia's last act. It was not kindness. It was not a gesture of love or remorse. It was a crooked deathbed act of contrition, a final convoluted attempt to balance her own invisible ledger. She wasn't giving me the property as a gift. She was giving me a weapon, acknowledging the suffering she had silently witnessed and sanctioned for all those years. It was her way of settling her own account with whatever God she believed in. The proof, I murmured, my gaze falling to the dirt-stained oilcloth-wrapped book in my hands. I held it up. I have the proof. The lawyer's eyes fixed on the thick black volume. What is that exactly? This, I said, my voice as cold and steady as a frozen river, is the family's black ledger. It is the account book where my husband recorded every one of my perceived failings, every sigh, every small mistake, turning my life into a series of debts that I was forced to pay with my own pain. And this, I added, my voice hardening, is the book where, 10 years ago, he began a new account for my 6-year-old daughter. I opened the book and showed him the page. I showed him Linda's name. I showed him my own defiant scrawl, credit, freedom. His professional composure crumbled as he scanned the previous pages, his eyes widening in horror as he read the cold, cruel entries. Insolence and insubordination, debt severe, correction of attitude administered. He closed the book gently, as if it were radioactive, his hand trembling slightly. "This is an abomination," he whispered. He cleared his throat, regaining his professional tone, but his eyes held a new respect, a new understanding. This book is powerful proof of Charles's moral and legal incapacity to inherit. It confirms the conditions of Patricia's will beyond any doubt. In that moment, standing in that quiet clearing, I understood the true scale of my victory. I hadn't just escaped Charles. I had taken from him the only thing he truly worshipped, his system of control. The black ledger was no longer the symbol of my subjugation. It was my legal weapon, the irrefutable proof of his perversion. The legal battle that followed was fought with me hundreds of miles away, with Mr. Johnson as my champion. The ledger was the centerpiece of the proceedings. From his prison cell, Charles was apoplectic. He denied everything. He claimed the book was a private journal, a simple tool for household discipline that I had maliciously misinterpreted. But he could not deny his own handwriting. The detailed pages, the cold, implacable logic of the debits and payments, painted a picture for the judge of a man so obsessed with control that he was, as his mother had written, unfit to manage anything with humanity. The ledger gave me the power to face him one last time, not as a victim, but as the instrument of his final ruin. Mr. Johnson arranged it. I met him in a prison visiting room, a thick pane of glass separating us. He was thinner, paler, but the same cold fire of righteous fury burned in his eyes. "You stole it from me, Donna," he hissed, his voice a venomous rasp over the telephone receiver. "That was my order, my legacy, my house." I looked at the man on the other side of the glass and felt nothing but a profound, weary pity. He was a king with no kingdom, a judge with no jurisdiction. I picked up my own receiver. "It was never a house, Charles," I said calmly. "It was a prison. And your legacy isn't order. It's this." I held up a single notarized copy of a page from the ledger against the glass. "This is your soul, Charles, and it's bankrupt." I placed the receiver back in its cradle and walked away without looking back, leaving him to his rage in his cage of concrete and steel. But the story wasn't over. There was the matter of the uncle, Larry, the man who held the other half of the farm, Mr. Johnson explained that Larry had returned from a self-imposed exile, bitter and determined to get what he was owed. He wanted one thing: to sell the entire property as quickly as possible, take his money, and disappear. Our first meeting took place in the lawyer's dusty office. Larry was a hard-faced man, his features etched with years of resentment. He looked at me with open disdain, seeing me as nothing more than the wife of the tyrant who had ruined his life. "Look, Mrs." He started, his voice rough. "I don't care about your marital squabbles or that spooky old book you've got. My brother was a monster. My sister-in-law was a snake. I just want my due. We sell. We split the money. End of story." "I'm not selling," I said, my voice quiet but firm. 10 years of surviving on my own, of pride earned in the clamor of the factory, had given me an armor he couldn't see. "I'm taking Patricia's share, and with my share, I'm taking control." Larry let out a harsh, barking laugh. "With what? You don't have 2 cents to rub together. How are you going to buy me out?" I placed the black ledger on the table between us. It was a theatrical gesture, but it had the effect of a silent explosion in the small room. "I have this," I said. "This book is the proof that the farm was not just a place of business. It was a theater of systematic cruelty. It contains a detailed, dated list of my husband's moral crimes. If you force a sale, Mr. Johnson and I will make this story public. We will ensure that the name of this farm is forever associated with the story of the man who kept a ledger of his wife's soul. Tell me, Larry, how much is land worth when it's soaked in that kind of poison?" My threat wasn't financial. It was reputational. I was threatening to destroy the one thing Charles and Patricia had valued as much as control: their secrecy, their veneer of respectability. Larry went pale. The fight went out of his eyes. The negotiations were long, but the outcome was never in doubt. With a loan arranged by Mr. Johnson, who was now my fierce advocate, I bought out Larry's share. It took years of my factory wages to pay it off, but one afternoon, the phone rang. "It's done, Donna," Mr. Johnson said. "The property is signed over. You are the sole owner." I returned to the farm one last time. I did not ask my children, now young adults, to come with me. This was my journey to make a loan. The house was empty, silent, thick with the smell of dust and decay. I walked into the kitchen. The oak hutch was still there, its top shelf empty, a vacant throne. And in that moment, I knew what my final act of justice had to be. I did not sell the farm. I dismantled it. I hired a crew and told them to tear it all down, stone by stone. The house, the barn, the outbuildings, all of it. I watched as the walls of my prison crumbled, as the roof that had sheltered so much misery fell in on itself. It was more than vengeance. It was an exorcism. I wanted to erase every physical trace of Charles's reign from the face of the earth. The climax was the burning of the great oak hutch. I watched the flames lick at the dark wood, consuming the altar of my oppression, turning it into a plume of gray ash that drifted away on the wind. Standing in the ruins of my former life, I felt the last of the chains fall away. I had the land plowed over and planted a grove of oak trees, turning a field of pain into a forest of peace and endurance. The final chapter, however, took place not on the farm, but in the small apartment I still called home. My children, Linda and Robert, were grown, building their own lives. One Sunday afternoon, I called them to me. With a gravity they had never seen in me before, I placed the black ledger on the kitchen table. A shadow passed over their faces. They remembered. I told them everything. Not just the story of the escape, but the intimate history of the fear, the accounting of cruelty, every line item of my soul. I showed them the page with Linda's name. When I finished, they were weeping. Not for themselves, but for the young woman I had been, trapped and alone. "Why didn't you ever tell us?" Linda asked, her voice thick with tears. "Because I needed you to grow up free," I explained. "I needed you to believe that your worth was not something that could be measured or recorded by anyone else. The only debt you ever have is to yourselves, to live a good and honest life." Then I told them the destiny I had chosen for the book. "I kept this as proof of what must never be," I said. "But today we're going to change its meaning." I took the ledger and carefully tore out the remaining 24 blank pages from the back. With a new pen and fresh ink, we began to write. We did not write a list of debts. We wrote a bill of rights for our family. We wrote, "The law of unconditional love." The heart of this family is a place without debts or accounts. Mistakes are answered with forgiveness, not penance. The law of personal sovereignty. No one can own the body or spirit of another. The law of the right to err. A mistake is not a crime. It is a chance to learn. The law of the right to speak. Every voice is valid. Every question is worthy. Silence is not a virtue. The Black Ledger became our book of life. I told them that one day, when they had children of their own, this book was to be passed down, not as a relic of cruelty, but as a testament to the price of freedom and the sacred importance of kindness. In that moment, I had finally succeeded. I had transformed the proof of my torment into the foundation of their legacy. Thank you for listening to me today, for allowing me to share with you this intimate chapter of my life. If my story has touched you, please don't hesitate to leave a like on this video and subscribe to this channel to discover other testimonies like mine. And please share it, because who knows? Maybe someone going through a similar trial right now will find the courage to keep searching, to hope, to believe in the impossible. Tell me in the comments, where are you listening from today? Thank you from the bottom of my heart for listening to me.